in about a couple of minutes.
Hello, everyone. We will start in a minute or 2 minutes. Пока мы не начали организационное объявление, у нас действует синхронный перевод, так что если вы хотите слушать все презентации, все
While we're getting ready, please mind that we provide simultaneous interpretation. There is a globe-shaped button at the bottom of your screen which allows you to toggle between channels, and you can pick either Russian or English.
We have simultaneous translation, so if you want to listen to all the presentations in English, please choose the English channel under the button with the globe in the bottom of the Zoom window. Ну, я думаю, что мы можем начинать. Вот сейчас.
I think we can get started. Good morning, good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm Igor Makarov. I'm head of the climate change lab at the Higher School of Economics. And today we host a very important and very momentous event. We'll launch a joint report produced by the World Bank and the Higher School of Economics called Russia and Green Transition, Risks and Opportunities. It took us a long time to produce the report. In fact, we spent about 18 months. And today we're ready to present to you the outcomes of this major effort. We are keen to share these results with you, our friends and colleagues. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Ivan Prostakov, Vice President of the Higher School of Economics, to welcome you. Ivan, over to you. Thank you very much, Igor. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome you and welcome the new report. It is a very important occasion, very important event for the Higher School of Economics. This is an outgrowth of our previous work. However, we should also recall that earlier this year we presented another report. Today we're gonna present the report dealing with economy, and the one I'm referring to right now is more policy-based reports dealing with the Russia's approach to green transformation. So we can trace some continuity here. It's a very good trend, I should say. We respond, and not just respond, but we present our vision with respect to the challenges we're all are facing. And obviously, this green transition topic, the topic of transition to low carbon economy is a key topic today. In addition to welcoming you, in addition to thanking my colleagues and sharing our pride in working with the World Bank. And in fact, the first report I referred to was launched in April. And Renal Seligman and Maxim Reshetnikov, the minister, were present at that launch. Now, I'd like to also mention that the quality of any study, any research, hinges not only on a professional analysis of the current trends or challenges and opportunities for Russia and scenarios that we may choose in the challenging environment of today, something that we see in this report. In addition to this, any high-quality study, any high-quality research project has a most important indicator, and that is the fact that such a study or report makes us think and further review the topics raised by the study. When I read the report, I immediately started to ponder over some of the issues. Well, first, obviously, this country is facing new economic challenges. It is about to enter new economic context. And this report contains a number of scenarios describing some different export routes for Russian exports, moving away from EU, penetrating other markets. So apparently, I asked myself, apparently this applies to other countries. This applies to the global economy at large. And at a certain point, we may find ourselves in a situation when the world map will be covered with various shades of green. Does this mean that we are facing a new model, especially given that the old globalization model is evolving and transforming? Are we at the brink of a new globalization? Are we entering the age of new constraints that will separate us in a different way? And this triggered another question. The report with respect to Russia deals with one of SDGs. Given the current circumstances, given the current context, given the possible split of our world into different shades of gray, how should we approach the other 16 SDGs, and how can we do this balancing act? How can we align all those SDGs, especially since their value, their importance is equal for all countries, for all peoples, for all continents? How to avoid any contradictions or conflicts between the SDGs? I mean, all the changes I'm referring to should bring people together instead of separating them. So once again, it is with great pleasure that I read such reports, including the one we're going to talk about today, exactly because this high-quality analysis allows to think of some other issues that may be beyond this specific report, specific study, which by nature is pretty narrow, and it is narrow for a reason. Now, there may be some other issues that need to be addressed. There may be some other questions you might want to ask. And this indicates to the fact that such research, such studies are very relevant. And at any rate, the Higher School of Economics that deals with virtually all SDGs is very keen to continue this work, and very much hope we'll be able to continue our collaboration with the bank in this area. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you for the welcoming address, and thank you for the challenges that you posed for us. It is my pleasure to invite Renaud Seligman, the World Bank Country Director and ResRep in Russia. He contributed tremendously to the development of this report, and in fact, he monitored very closely this exercise throughout the process. Renaud, over to you. Thank you very much. Igor, it's a pleasure to see you. It's a pleasure to see you again. Look, this is a wonderful day, the day of that is frosty and sunny. What else to wish for? But seriously, we're very happy to welcome the launch of this report. It's an outcome of a fairly long project, yet it is of crucial importance for Russia and for the entire world. Ivan just mentioned some of those issues, and this green transition is indeed key. This green transition is something we should think about, and we should try to see what kind of implications it may bring for Russia. I guess the key issue is as follows. We got to understand why Russia should change its business model, why Russia should look for alternative growth sources. Why not continue? Why not continue the current approach? And I think that this report indicates that risks that are present today are very high, and the risks might be even higher unless Russia does something. Perhaps I can switch into English.
The level of uncertainty that the world is facing and that Russia is facing in particular in relation to climate change is high, in the sense that it's not quite clear exactly how other regions of the world will respond. But some things are already clear, which is what the EU is doing, what now the US is doing. There is increasing clarity about the direction of travel of China as well. And so what the report is really showing is, faced with that level of certainty and uncertainty, what are the least risky strategies for Russia? What are those strategies that might lead to the best outcome for growth, for income, for the Russian people? And clearly, diversification would be a major element of the response. And what I think one of the key high-level messages of the report is that in a scenario where others are moving towards a greener future, Russia will be better off if it takes action itself, rather than letting other blocs such as the EU tax its products and capture the price of carbon for their own benefit, rather than if Russia does it itself and uses the funds to invest in a greener future. So I think that there are a lot of very useful findings and insights from this report. And Ну, вообще, я очень рад, чтобы мы сотрудничество.
Look, overall, I'm very happy with our cooperation, our very fruitful and efficient cooperation with Harris School of Economics. Look, this is not the only example of our collaboration, but it's a very telling example. Therefore, I want to thank Vice President Prostakov, and I want to thank you, Igor, and your lab for this collaboration. And I do hope that this report will help Russia and other countries to find efficient ways forward. Thank you very much, Renaud. Thank you for your intervention. It is my pleasure to invite a colleague from the World Bank, Sandeep Mukherjee, who is responsible for governance and fiscal issues for the WE&IA. Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vice Rector Prostakov, colleagues, esteemed participants. Greetings to all of you in sunny Moscow from cloudy Washington. I'm hoping that we take our cues on the weather from Moscow today. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this event that is being organized in close collaboration with the Higher School of Economics to present the World Bank's new report, Russia and the Global Green Transition. I think following from what Professor Prostakov and Renaud said, is to highlight the momentous change that the world is seeing in terms of a global green transition gaining pace. Coming out of COP26, as we know, more than 60 countries, which is more than 80% of the world GDP, have committed to carbon neutrality sometime in the future. And if the world is serious about it, we will see some major overhauling of the policy frameworks, of the market structures, of the trading structures across the world to realize these ambitions. And we have to be alert to this. And luckily, we see that Russia is being alert to it. It was very heartening to see President Putin make a commitment on behalf of Russia, committing the country to carbon neutrality by 2060. And now the country has a new low carbon development strategy, which targets both higher economic growth and cutting emissions in the medium term. It's a very noble ambition. It's going to be a very difficult ambition. We are talking about two major transitions here, which have to happen at the same time. One transition is to a market economy, and the other transition is to a green economy. And it has to be done while protecting those who are poor, who are vulnerable to these transitions, and tackling the physical impacts of climate change. So it is going to be challenging. And it's a defining challenge for the leaders of our age. And I think, as Renaud was saying as well, we cannot afford to wait around to see what happens. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we have to act in this uncertainty, and we cannot afford to wait around, because by the time we find out more, the transition will have become even more costly and difficult to manage. So the key challenge for Russia is to manage these two transitions: economic growth, market transition, and green at the same time. We see it being an important virtuous cycle to achieve. It'll be difficult to get a green transition with an economy that's not growing. So it's important to have growth. But at the same time, we think that a green transition can be an important input into economic growth. So they can reinforce each other. It's very important to get this reinforcing mechanism. And that's what this report is all about. So we think that the new low carbon vision will require reimagining economic structures of Russia, building world-class market institutions and assets to support a competitive economy that is led by productivity and innovation and global integration and good governance, and which provides good quality, sustainable, and resilient incomes for everyone. But it's not all about risks. As has been mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities and for Russia to avail in this green transition as well. This report presents scenarios and options for Russia to consider for its green economic transition process. It will be followed, I think, as some of you know, by the Russia Climate Change Development Report, the CCDR. The CCDR will go into even more depth at the sectoral level in looking at challenges and opportunities arising from climate change and green transition. And it's going to identify policy options to support the achievement of the national development objectives. Together, these two products for us represent the core analytical products that shape the World Bank cooperation with countries, Russia and other countries, and identify opportunities for priority action and support. So with that, let me welcome you once again on behalf of the World Bank and say that we remain committed to supporting you on this important journey. I wish you a good discussion and a wonderful day. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Сандип.
Sandeep, thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite Anastasia Likachova, the Dean of the World Economy and Policy at the Harris School of Economics. Anastasia, over to you. Igor, thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you at this event. Look, it's a pity that we cannot have this wonderful event face-to-face, but I hope that this is a good sign indicating that the topic that you raise in this report and the various scenarios covered by the report will help us pursue those issues further and deeper, because many issues touched upon by this report merit further in-depth research and studies. Indeed, over the past 2 years in this country, in terms of understanding the climate issues and importance of the environmental agenda in the broad sense, we've seen a green revolution of a sort. And for this country, it is a major shift in terms of framing the economic development agenda and framing the interaction between the governments and society at large and nature, framing the relationship between education and economy. This project on the part of the Harris School of Economics was supported by the Climate Change Lab headed by Igor. In fact, it is a unit that does research, but also this is a unit that answers the many questions asked by our students. I mean, why study green transition? Why address green issues? I mean, this is a fairly obvious response. By doing this, you can influence the future path of the country's development. And the fact that Igor and colleagues are trying to attack the most challenging issues and seek possible solutions is something that we very much welcome. We see that young people increasingly take interest in those topics, and they are ready and willing to address this agenda. And we, as a department of our university, welcome this. Now, back to the report proper. Once again, we're very happy to expand and further expand our collaboration with the bank. And I hope that this is just the beginning. Regretfully, the sheer scale of climate issues provides us with an ample room for further collaboration. Having said that, I'd like to emphasize that such work should be accompanied by broad-based discussion with other stakeholders, with society at large. And I hope that this event will serve not only to launch the report and to support the discussion of its conclusions, but I think it should also start a broad-based discussion in Russia as to how this country could address the new challenges, what kind of risks we'll be facing, what kind of opportunities this country and the entire region might capitalize on. And perhaps this is something we might also scale up to the regional level. Perhaps we can raise this issue with our international partners who have similar energy balances and face similar challenges. The Glasgow conference indicated that the more dialogues we have, the better we join our forces, the more efficient we'll be responding to the new challenges. Once again, I welcome all the participants of this event, and especially the authors of this report. And in addition to reaching new successes in the climate area, I want to wish you that we are able to meet face to face and we're able to do such studies in the field. Thank you, Anastasia. We're also very much hopeful that we'll be able to have face-to-face events to launch such events and not just doing the conferences in Zoom.
That these questions should be a part of our wide public discussion. So for this public discussion to be reflected, in particular measures on the climate policy and other types of policies, which somehow are related to the climate agenda. So the leaders of the climate policy at the federal level, the major engine of the climate policy in Russia, from my perspective, the Ministry of Economic Development, which has done a lot over the recent years to work out new approaches to the climate policy, working out drawing up particular documents. As we already mentioned, there is a strategy in place, long-term strategy of low carbon development, which will be fine-tuned through different sectorial plans of actions, which is being implemented already on the regional level as a Sakhalin pilot project. And this great work undertaken by the Ministry of Economic Development, from my perspective, is very pivotal to implement many ideas reflected in the report and to adjust Russia to the challenges it faces in the global green transition. I'd like to give the floor to Andrei Chaika, who is the head of the Department for Competition, Energy Efficiency and Environmental Protection. This particular department made a lot of contribution to the climate and gender development. I'm very happy to welcome Andrei, and over to you. Igor, thank you very much for the floor. Dear colleagues from the World Bank, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great privilege for us to see that the global transformation issues are covered by many specialists and are very important in the academia, in the expert community. Igor, you were right to say that the key document, blueprint document, which stipulates long-term priorities for our policy, was approved by the government in November Strategy 2050, which describes in detail of how the Russian Federation is going to get on track of the intensive scenario of low emission level of greenhouse gases and kind of lays prerequisites for low carbon transformation of different industries. From this perspective, we see that those findings, which can be seen in the report provided today, are very useful for us. And undoubtedly, we're very interested in deepening these findings. So the scenario should be based and balanced, taking into account different aspects of different industries' activities. From this perspective, we're very open to our interaction, to our collaboration in the future. We're very interested in the approaches you leverage, the interpretation and the findings. And I'd like to also mention that apart from this strategy, this year, we have adopted two more documents. This is the law on limitations on greenhouse gases emissions, which stipulates kind of soft regulation, which then boils down to carbon reporting for the companies. And there is a foundation for climate projects implementation. We believe that such an approach is market-oriented and is in line with those rules and priorities undertaken by the Article 6 of Paris Agreement in Glasgow. As you know, the set of rules has been adopted with the active participation of our Russian business community and us as a regulator. We are very happy to see these development as it lays the foundation for international carbon market development. And the second document, which has been approved this week on the experiment development, in particular regions of Russia, which stipulates a stricter regulation. And it is connected with the fact that the region is planning to reach carbon neutrality by 2026, the Sakhalin region in particular, but this project stipulates not only one region. This project stipulates the opportunity for other regions interested to join the pilot project, provides for the mechanism, the quota system particularly, shapes the foundation for the regional inventory process. The co-regional aspect is to be developed from our perspective this week. This draft is being considered by the State Duma, and it is going to go through different chambers of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. I'd like to thank you a lot for the invitation. Very open to our interaction, collaboration, and ready to discuss this particular report, a new report on the climate policy. Thank you very much for attention. Thank you very much, Andrei. We do hope that in the future, our collaboration is going just to be tighter for the Russian climate policy, to be even more useful for the development of the Russian economy and in the climate change fight. Dear colleagues, I'm going to take the floor to give you a major flavor of the structure of the report, which objectives are set and major goals of the report. And then further on, our colleagues are going to elaborate on particular blocks of our report in detail, and particular findings made. I'm going to share my screen. I do hope that you can see my presentation. Here you can see the report is going to be accessible on the website of the World Bank very soon. This report sets three major objectives. On the one hand, within this report, we try to evaluate the consequences of global green transition, the attempts of the countries to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases undertaken by many states globally on the Russian economy. And a separate exercise within this report, and the big objective was to evaluate the consequences of the CBAM. We call it in a different way. It's called the cross borders. Somebody in Russia calls it border carbon tax, but the right translation into Russian is the CBAM of the European Union, which is carbon border adjustment mechanism in Russian, and the consequences for the Russian export and for the Russian economic development, for the Russian industrial output. That's all has been looked into within this report. On the other hand, we try to understand how Russia can mitigate those losses which are possible as a result of these measures to reduce greenhouse gases emission, which are more active today. So we had a task to evaluate what Russia should undertake for these losses to be minimized. Thirdly, we try to analyze the opportunities in front of Russia within this global green transition. It's absolutely clear that even though the Russian economy is still dependent on the export and the production of fossil fuels and different carbon-intensive industries. But of course, the global green transition is not just the set of risks, but different opportunities in industries in the Russian economy, which might win out of this transition. The transformation of the existing industries and decarbonization of these industries may facilitate faster Russian economic growth. So we tried to look into these opportunities within the report. The report consists of 4 parts. First, we're trying to look into the development of the Russian economy over the last decade and the dependence of the Russian economy on the fossil fuel, particularly what makes it vulnerable to this global green transition. Further on, we took a detailed analysis and models of the consequences and implications of the global green transition for the Russian economy. We take 2 tasks. On the one hand, we look separately at the CBAM and the implications of Russia to 2035, and separately we looked at the implications of long-term decarbonization for the Russian economy till 2050. Decarbonization, global decarbonization, the efforts of different states, many of which have already undertaken commitments to achieve carbon neutrality for the Russian exports, for the Russian assets, for the Russian welfare and GDP particularly. In the third part of our report, after covering the risks and evaluating these risks, we demonstrate how it's possible to launch a green transition of the Russian economy and why we need that. Which motivation lies behind that? We look at the green transformation of the Russian economy not as a response to the risks and threats we see globally, not as a way to mitigate the risks associated with the decarbonization of the global economy, but as an opportunity to diversify the Russian economy, make Russian economic growth more sustained and sustainable, not only from the environmental perspective, but from the economic point of view as well, to make this economic growth more resilient to externalities. Igor, unfortunately, your presentation doesn't scroll down, so we still see your first slide. I'm going to relaunch my presentation. I hope you can see the slide. My apologies. In the third part, we demonstrate that the green transition of the Russian economy is going to facilitate diversification of the Russian economy and the sustainable economic growth. So we cover the conditions for this green transition to be effective and to be feasible. And we pay particular focus on the domestic climate policy in Russia, particularly connected with the carbon pricing issues and the green financing, which creates the foundation for the Russian economy to develop in a greener way. In the fourth part of our report, we cover new opportunities in front of the Russian economy thanks to green transition. We're talking about new industries. This is the renewable energy sector, particularly, which is the most evident beneficiary of the global decarbonization, but we also mention other sectors which are quite specific to the Russian Federation. We're talking about low carbon energy technologies, different from renewables, including carbon capture and storage facilities, hydro energy, nuclear energy, energy efficiency development. We're talking about new minerals, metals, the demand for which is going to ever increase in metals and other minerals, the demand for which is going to grow thanks to the global transition. We're talking about Russian forests as an important competitive edge of Russia in a new greener world. So we start with the statement that the Russian economy is really dependent on the fossil fuel. This dependence can be seen and regarded in different ways. You can see this slide where it's quite explicit that there is intercorrelation between the pace of oil prices and economic growth in Russia. The economic growth is faster with higher oil prices. It's kind of an external factor which determines the economic development pace in Russia. On the other hand, on this slide, you can also see that the slowdown of the Russian economy in this situation with the blue curve line, which demonstrates the economic growth in Russia, is lower than the orange line, which demonstrates the global economic growth. So it happened in 2012. And since that time, the situation has been the same. It happened before oil prices fell. So the economic model, growth model, is mostly oriented at the export of hydrocarbons, production and export of hydrocarbon intensive products. So it faced problems even before the oil prices fell in 2014. On the other hand, the dependence in Russia on fossil fuels can be seen. This is the structure of the export balance in 2020. It's quite explicit that the Russian export is mostly determined by the fossil fuels, which makes Russia quite vulnerable to the decarbonization global trends, which stipulate the reduction in demand for fossil fuel. It makes Russia vulnerable to two types of risks. There are risks which Russia faces as of today, the Russian exporters particularly, connected with the introduction of this CBAM by the European Union, and there are some risks associated with midterm and long-term future, the reduction of demand for the Russian fossil fuels and the corresponding decrease in the welfare and in GDP. These two types of risks are major assessment issues within the second part of our report. The tool to model is a global environmental impact sustainability applied general equilibrium envisage model, which is calibrated to the global trade analysis project. The specificity of this report is the work of several task force, which used the same model named envisage. But to solve the different tasks, this model was a little bit applied in different ways, was calibrated in different ways. There was a different regional aggregation, industrial aggregation for these two types of tasks. But the colleagues did a lot of work to harmonize the approaches and to make these two research results. The first one is dedicated to CBAM, and the second is to long-term decarbonization trends to be harmonized and to be compatible. I believe we managed to do that, although these are two absolutely different exercises which use different approaches, but are based on the same model. We can be sure, and that's what we demonstrate in our report, that the level of dependence of the Russian economy on the fossil fuel, which I have just demonstrated, creates low motivation for decarbonization of our economy. So the incentives are low, and so this picture particularly demonstrates that the share of hydrocarbon rent for different countries, on the other hand, the share of fossil fuels in the export balance of different countries, and demonstrate the Russian spot in G20 and in all these states where there is an active carbon regulation in the form of carbon pricing. We see that the major part of the countries where the regulation is in place is not that dependent on fossil fuels like Russia. Of course, for Russia, the active carbon regulation and the active green transition of the economy is kind of a challenge associated with the fact that the model that the Russian economy has been using for the development requires a lot of changes. We do understand that it's a very difficult task. And in this particular connection, this report has been developed. If it were a simple task, we wouldn't require additional effort to look into methods for Russian economic decarbonization. Nevertheless, at the same time, Russia has resources for this green transition to be launched. And this particular slide demonstrates that among all these states in G20, what is called policy space for economic policy, Russia has the maximum set of opportunities. Russia has the minimum level as of 2020, the shortage, budget deficit among G20 countries, and the minimum level of sovereign debt among G20 countries. So the opportunities for very active economic policy, which would require additional and huge investment, are in place. So the recovery from the pandemic inflicted crisis may create a new incentive for Russian green transition. Crisis is not only big drama show or a challenge, but this is a set of opportunities. So crisis is an opportunity to overhaul the current economic models, to shift to a new level, new high quality economic development. Many states see this crisis as an opportunity, and we believe that Russia should also regard this crisis as a new opportunity to give new impetus to the Russian economy, try to adjust the economic model in Russia, which we have seen over the last decade in Russia, and to make it more resilient to those external shocks, which we are going to elaborate on. And the last thing I'd like to mention before I give the floor to colleagues of mine who are going to elaborate on different parts of the report after modeling. The green transition gives Russia a particular set of opportunities. These opportunities connected with the diversification of the Russian economy, for the opportunity to change the structure of the Russian economy, which may address the challenges of a new time, low carbon intensive, with bigger potential on the global market in a mid and long-term perspective. On the other hand, this is an opportunity to develop new industries of Russian economy. So for them, for their development, we require particular regulatory framework, which would include the energy climate policy, a big part of green transition, which includes the financial infrastructure associated with the green finance development. That's what our report, the report of the third and fourth part are going to be about. That's where I'd like to wrap up my brief introductory statement, which gives the overall outline of the strategy, the major logic behind, the major ideas behind this. So I'd like to give the floor to colleagues of mine who particularly were responsible for modeling and who are going to tell us about the results. And the first, I would like to give the floor to Hassan Dudu, the senior economist in the World Bank, who was a key person in evaluating the implications of CBAM for the Russian economy. Hassan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Igor, and thank you very much for the collaboration and opportunity. I will first give the floor to Daniel to first briefly describe what we did, and then I will talk about the main findings of the report. So
Я прошу прощения, я, к сожалению, не увидел.
I didn't see that Daniel is with us.
Yep.
Now I'd like to introduce Daniel Besley, the senior climate change specialist of the World Bank. Over to you, Daniel. My apologies.
No problem. Thank you very much, Igor. And very happy to be able to present some of the work that's in this report, focusing on the impact of the EU adopting a border carbon adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, on Russia. Next slide, thanks. And Hassan and I will share this presentation. I'll basically do a bit of an introduction about the approach, and then Hassan will get into the results. Firstly, just to have a look at how exposed is the Russian economy to the EU CBAM, and this slide looks at the trade exposure, so the value of Russia's exports to the EU in key sectors likely to be covered by a CBAM. And then we have a look at, of its total exports, what share of those go to the EU. And we can see, therefore, the sectors that are going to be of particular interest: the iron and steel sector, refined petroleum products in particular, chemical sector, that's fairly sizable exports to the EU, and then aluminium and other non-ferrous metals. Now, the fossil fuel exports, so crude oil, coal and gas, are sizable exports to the EU, but are unlikely to be covered in CBAM in the near term. But we have run scenarios looking at that, given the size of the exports for Russia to the EU. So given the importance of those to Russia, we've run essentially a sensitivity looking at those. Thanks. So in terms of the scenarios we've run, a global trade and environment model known as Envisage. It's a CGE model based on the GTAP10 Power database, and we've updated all the latest information for Russia in it. So we've updated the input-output tables for Russia up to the latest information we could get. So the scenarios that we ran, and you'll see in the results and in the report, are standard business as usual without CBAM, and existing level of climate policy consistent with countries' levels of NDC. So for Russia, we have the NDC level of action in Russia. Then we have a look at what is the impact of introducing CBAM. And we did these scenarios and developed this model for Russia before the EU proposal was published, but you'll see it's pretty close, and we've covered all the key elements in the current proposal. In the report, we introduced CBAM in 2 phases. In the first phase, we cover the sectors you can see there on the screen: steel, cement, electricity, and chemicals. And then we introduce a second phase where they increase the scope to a few other very likely products that could be covered under CBAM in 2025. Then we have a range of scenarios that look at different elements. So we cover only Scope 1 emissions. We have a look at what happens if only Scope 1 emissions is covered. So that's consistent with the current proposal. Then we have a look at what happens if they bring in Scope 2 emissions. And so by Scope 2 emissions, I mean the emissions associated with the electricity used in these CBAM sectors. Then we have a look at expanding CBAM to fossil fuels, as I mentioned, particular interest to Russia. And then we had a look at what happens if more than just the EU adopts CBAM. And so we had a look at how, what would be the impact if the USA also adopts it in addition to the EU. And then we had a look at what is the impact on Russia of the EU adopting CBAM if we see other countries in the region start to take real action on carbon pricing, on climate action, and start to decarbonize their economy. The way that we have looked at this action is proxy this action is through the adoption of a carbon price. And we've looked at fairly ambitious actions that are consistent with the EU ETS price. Then we had a look at what happens if countries then start to respond to CBAM by taking action to decarbonize their economies. And we've done this again through proxying a carbon price, using a carbon price in Russia, starting from 0 and then reaching the EU level, the EU ETS price in 2030. And it's important to note that when we do this, the CBAM price that's applied is applied to the difference between the EU ETS price and the carbon price in Russia. So the more action that Russia takes, the lower the CBAM price is. The other thing we've taken into account in determining the CBAM price is the level of free allocation in the EU ETS. The EU has signaled that they will do this in their proposal, recognizing that free allocation can reduce the costs imposed on EU CBAM producers. And so for equal treatment for importers to the EU, they've signaled to take free allocation into account when determining the CBAM price that's applied to imports. When we have a look at applying a carbon price as a proxy for action in Russia, we have a look at how what the impact might be of different ways in which we can recycle the revenue raised from carbon pricing. And we look at recycling those revenues to households. We also look at recycling those revenues to investments. And with that, I'll hand back over to Hassan to go through the results. Thanks, Hassan.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Now I will go through, as I said, I mean, the main findings from the report. So I will not, I mean, discuss all the detailed results which are in the report. So I mean, the first thing we find is that, I mean, some sectors will be hit more than others, right? I mean, so these graphs shows what would happen to exports of Russia to the EU. I mean, EU free trade area actually. And I mean, these are percentage changes from the reference scenario. So here, as you see, I mean, that, well, electricity trade is small, but it's there for completeness. But here, as you see, I mean, chemicals, for example, would be hit really hard, especially if scope 2 emissions are covered, because I mean, the most of the emissions in chemical sector is from electricity use, which is included only if scope 2 is covered. But even with scope 1, chemicals would be affected significantly, right? I mean, much more than others. But I mean, the losses in other sectors are in no way small. I mean, they are between 15 to 20%. So this shows what would happen to exports to EU. So if we look at the total exports to EU, we see a much smaller loss, around, I mean, 3% with scope 1 emissions and 7 or up, I mean, slightly below 8% loss if, I mean, if scope 1 and scope 2 are included in the CBAM calculations. So I mean, here one interesting thing is, I mean, in 2030, I mean, the EU, I mean, we reach the NDC targets, then, I mean, EU's carbon price stabilizes. I mean, it increases slowly over time to keep it, I mean, constant in real terms. But as you see, the exports are not bouncing back. So here, I mean, we can say that if this happens, the damage would be permanent, right? I mean, when EU carbon price is stabilized, I mean, the loss would still be there. But I mean, how does this translate into GDP? I mean, the impacts on GDP are small. Why? I mean, because of what, I mean, Professor Prostakov mentioned, because there will be other markets that Russia can divert exports. I mean, I will show a graph about this. But here, I mean, as you see, I mean, if you look at the scale, which I should have added another digit here, but I mean, the losses, the growth losses are, I mean, 0.1 to 0.2% in the worst case, where scope 1, 2 is included, and US also imposes, other ECA countries imposes a carbon price, and hence can capture, I mean, can capture some of the market share of Russia. So, but I mean, overall, or headline message here is that, I mean, at the macroeconomic level, we don't expect huge impacts from the CBAM. Now, this is what happens to exports to EU. I mean, as you see, I mean, the title is misleading. What happens to exports to EU and rest of the world? As you see, the more exports goes down for EU, I mean, there will be increases in exports to the rest of the world in CBAM sectors. But for me, what is really interesting is this part. I mean, where, I mean, services and non-energy intensive goods and oil exports of Russia would be increasing both to the EU and to the rest of the world. And this is, I mean, when we first saw these results, we were a little bit puzzled, but that's why we are doing the model, right? I mean, to show us what we don't expect or what we cannot, I mean, see directly. But here what's happening is, first, I mean, EU is putting a tax on energy intensive CBAM commodities. I mean, and that is by design, right? I mean, that's why these commodities are included. Now, since EU will reduce the imports for these commodities, I mean, they will need to produce them domestically in the EU. And for that, they would need energy because, as I said, I mean, these are energy-intensive commodities, and I mean, Russia as one of the most competitive suppliers of oil to EU, increases their exports to EU. But what happens with non-energy intensive goods? I mean, now the second step of the story is that EU uses these CBAM commodities as intermediate inputs in the production of other commodities. These non-intensive commodities like machinery, I mean, steel is used in machinery and motor vehicles, etc. So what happens here is, I mean, with the increasing prices of those intermediate inputs, and with higher competition from CBAM sectors in EU for the resources, I mean, for labor, for capital, for intermediate inputs, EU starts to import more of non-energy intensive goods, right? I mean, would this happen? I mean, of course, this is really conditional on, I mean, the other EU policies and other things, but if nothing, I mean, ceteris paribus, I mean, this is the expected result, right? I mean, so EU would also increase imports for non-energy intensive commodities, and Russia would hence increase exports to EU in these commodities. So, I mean, in the second part of our analysis, we look at, I mean, would taking action change anything on behalf of Russia, right? So what would happen if Russia follows a more ambitious mitigation action, which is, I mean, which, as Daniel mentioned, we simulate by introducing a carbon tax starting in 2023 from very low level, actually from zero, and reaching to the EU carbon price level by 2030. Now here, as you see, again, the story is really, I mean, sector dependent. I mean, in some sectors, like, I mean, in chemicals, I mean, this action because when you introduce the carbon tax, as Daniel said, I mean, you reduce the amount of CBAM tax that your sectors pay, right? They only pay the difference between EU price and your carbon price. So but on the other hand, these sectors pays carbon tax to Russia. So I mean, here what we are trying to see is, I mean, which sectors would benefit, the overall effect would be good for which sectors, and for which sectors it would be bad, right? I mean, it wouldn't bounce back. So here chemicals is affected more from the carbon price than they can recover from the reducing carbon CBAM tax. But in some sectors, you see the other way around, right? I mean, minerals and I mean, refined petroleum, I mean, I mean, a carbon tax benefits their exports to the EU, right? And I mean, yeah, let me go to the next slide. And I mean, here, I mean, actually, I can also say this. And here you see, I mean, how you use your carbon tax or carbon pricing revenues is the real determinant of what would happen to the economy. So the question is not really, I mean, how much the carbon price can, or what would be the impact of carbon price, but I mean, the question is, I mean, this impact is highly dependent on how you utilize your revenues, right? So here, I mean, you already see it in the export results, exports to EU. I mean, if the carbon tax revenue somehow can be translated into investments, and so increase your capital stock or productive capital, I mean, actually, carbon tax might be beneficial. I mean, for some sectors like aluminum. So, and this is the macro picture under the action. I mean, first thing you see here, I mean, here you see what would happen if the revenues are not used for investment, but to support households, right? I mean, this line. First, it doesn't destroy your economy. I mean, it is GDP impact is like minus 0.3%. It is not obvious in the figure, but that's the figure there. But if you use it for investment, I mean, you start a cycle that kicks off a growth path, and then your GDP starts growing significantly. Of course, this has a cost, right? I mean, because as economists, we all know there is no free lunch. So, I mean, this increase in GDP is at the cost of household welfare, because now you don't allow households to consume as much as the first scenario, but they need to save, and most of the resources goes to investment demand instead of household demand. So here, I mean, the headline message would be, I mean, Russia will need to manage transition carefully. So because here we don't have any other policy measures, we don't have any social protection network, no other support for the poorest parts of the society. But if this transition can be managed well with social protection programs, etc., then I mean there can be significant benefits of climate action for Russia. And I mean, what happens to the emissions? I mean, Russia can achieve significant amount of emission reductions, up to 30-35%, just with the carbon price. I mean, this again, I mean, does not cover other policy measures that would be in place in a green transition. So let me stop here, and I would be happy to answer any questions now or after all presentations. Thank you.
Спасибо, Daniel и Hassan.
Hassan, Daniel, thank you very much indeed. We have some time to entertain questions. In fact, we've gotten some questions already in the chat. Dear colleagues, please feel free to contribute your questions or request to speak. Now, the first question is, do we have some understanding as to how the CBAM could impact the EU and not just Russia? Question number two, I wonder if you could please clarify the level of carbon tax in 2030 in Russia. Something that you use in your scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So I might have a first go, Hassan. In terms of the impact on the EU, what we see is sort of what is expected, in that the CBAM is a good policy for protecting against carbon leakage, which is the main aim of the policy, because it is effective at leveling the playing field between domestic and foreign producers in the EU, more effective than the current policy in play to protect carbon leakage, which is free allocation under the EU ETS. As a result, the production of CBAM sectors in the EU rises. This has two effects that we see in the EU, as Hassan touched on in his presentation. One is that those CBAM sectors require more inputs, and because they're energy intensive, they require more energy. And you see an increase in fossil fuel imports to the EU. You also see a slight reduction in the production of higher value manufacturing in our model, higher value manufacturing, manufacturing that has CBAM inputs into their manufacturing process. And this is because foreign producers can produce those higher value manufacturing or further down the value chain manufacturing without paying a carbon price on their CBAM inputs. And so those further down the value chain may see, in the EU, may see a reduction in production. So that's the broad kind of changes that we see happen in the EU as a result of CBAM. And you'll see at the moment, some of those manufacturers are starting to have concerns similar to that. So you see the washing machine manufacturers, for example, starting to come out and have concerns about what the effect might be on their production. And therefore, how can the CBAM be designed to address those concerns? In terms of the carbon price that's applied in Russia, when we apply the carbon price to simulate action, we apply it equal to the EU ETS price in 2030, which is around between $100 and $120.
And just to add to the, I mean, on top of the price, we already have, I mean, some non-fiscal measures, right, like energy efficiency improvements, I mean, switch to renewables, etc., in the baseline, right? I mean, so, I mean, so our carbon price is really not a forecast, but an assumption. So we should put it clearly, right? I mean, Igor, would you like me to answer some other questions in the chat that I took note of?
Да, Хасан, у нас появляется еще...
Yes, Hassan. We keep receiving questions in our chat. There is this question about the extent of carbon leakage in EU without CBAM. There's a question about investment in the various green transition components. And there's a question about a balanced approach when some investment, some part of the investment goes to households and the other part to infrastructure.
Yeah. So, I mean, about the carbon leakage, I mean, we didn't simulate it, right? I mean, we don't have a baseline where we don't have the NDCs of the countries so that EU is imposing its NDC targets, then you see some leakage, right? And we didn't analyze it, honestly, because our focus was really on non-EU ECA countries, and in this report on Russia. But what I know is, I mean, with the same model, our trade colleagues ran a scenario, I mean, did another study for in ECA region, and they found significant amount of carbon leakage. I mean, because of EU imposing an NDC and other countries not, etc. So, but I mean, I mean, we can have a look at the model results sheet, but I expect we would find the same thing, right? I mean, without the CBAM, there would be significant leakage to other countries from EU. And then, I mean, the balanced approach, of course, I mean, you see this line, the green line here shows, I mean, am I sharing? Yes. So the green line here shows really the upper bound, right? Because we are transforming 100% of the revenues to investments, which is, I mean, neither feasible nor desirable, right? And this line is showing the lower bound because we are distributing all the tax revenues back to the households to support them during the transition. The reality will be in between somewhere. I mean, having more positive area here is encouraging, of course. I mean, that means, I mean, if we follow a balanced approach, we would be somewhere here, which would still have some growth benefits through investments, but also, I mean, change the shape of this curve so that households do not suffer until 2030. But I mean, this transition can be smoother. But I mean, we didn't simulate it. But I mean, for various reasons. But I mean, I think we mentioned this in the report that this is, I mean, the reality would be somewhere in between based on the ability of the Russia to translate carbon tax revenues into investments and ability of Russia to support the poorest sections of the population.
Might just quickly add, if it's okay. On carbon leakage, we have looked quite extensively at the extent to which there has been carbon leakage in the EU to date. And the World Bank's produced a number of reports on this. And there is no evidence really of any real carbon leakage. And that's large part because the free allocation has largely worked and has been pretty high levels to CBAM, to the kind of sectors that are trade exposed. If there were no CBAM in place, then you would expect the EU to maintain their free allocation. And yes, that's going to be challenging as their cap drops. But with CBAM, they have committed to reduce their free allocation to 0 by 2035. And so without CBAM, you would not see that commitment, I don't think. I'll just mention that. Thanks, Igor.
Спасибо. У нас появилось еще два вопроса. Первый вопрос.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions from Andrei Malakostov. One question refers to the model. How do you do recursion in your model? And is there a more detailed description of the model? And a question from Natalia Turubeva regarding the carbon price of $120. How come the price is $120 and there is zero effect on the GDP in Russia?
Now, I mean, on the first question, yes, the model is very well documented. It's open source. I mean, and I mean, there is also a detailed description of the model in the report in the annexes, right? But I mean, there's also, I mean, much detailed model documentation, and we can share it, right? I mean, this on GitHub available freely. And about the recursive dynamics, what we are doing is, I mean, we consider each year as static problems. Then when you solve for time t, you have investments and investments which are fed into the next period's capital stock. So the dynamics are really driven by the capital stock increase because of the investments, right? And then, I mean, this iterative process continues until 2035, right? I mean, but just one note, this is not a simple, I mean, capital stock updating, because we also have vintage capital specification in the model. So your investment and your old capital stock and your new investments are not same. I mean, new investment is more substitutable with energy, etc. So we are taking this into account. And old capital depreciate. I mean, as old capital depreciates, this new capital substitute to old capital. So this is basically the idea behind the recursive dynamics. And yes, I mean, you are reading right. So $120 carbon tax in 2030 causes very small GDP impacts, right? And this is first, I mean, this is, now I wonder if this is with respect to, but I mean, we explained this in the model, but I mean, the thing is really, I mean, when you tax carbon, I mean, at the economy level, I mean, you are just collecting money from the sectors, distributing it back to the households or investment, right? I mean, if I show you what happens to the sectors when you have $120 tax, I mean, what you will see is, I mean, there will be a lot of shifts in the economy. I mean, you will switch, I mean, the Russian economy will basically switch away from carbon intensive sectors, etc. So what GDP numbers shows here is that there will be a lot of reallocation, but when you add them up on the macro level, it will not have huge impacts, right? I mean, the huge impacts. And if you use the revenues for investment, there might even be GDP growth.
Спасибо. Коллеги, есть ли у нас...
Thank you very much. Any further questions to Dan or Hassan? Yeah, there is a question.
Did you consider an alternative when financing for investment goes from abroad, borrowing and not from households?
No, we did not try that. That would be a good, I mean, sensitivity analysis to look at. But I mean, probably the impact would be similar to well, might even be better than this, because in this case the households won't have to save. I mean, so these two graphs will look like, but then your trade balance will be affected, right? I mean, because if you are receiving foreign exchange from rest of the world, then I mean, you will probably import more, export less. You know, I mean, you need to keep the balance of payments. Then you will see some adverse effects on that side. So I mean, there are various options. I hope, I mean, that we will be able to analyze in consequent projects, just like, I mean, Sandeep mentioned the CCDR, which will go deeper into these issues. But I mean, the bottom line will be, I mean, there are many options. I mean, we can look at them, but in the report, we just wanted to show two extreme cases and trade-offs linked to them.
Спасибо.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks again, Dan. Thanks, Hassan. Now let us move on. We'll have some time for Q&A and discussion in the end, and we can revisit this part of our webinar. Oh, there is one more question, but let us put it off till the very end. We'll get back to this question in the end. Otherwise, we won't be able to cover the rest of our report. It is my pleasure to invite Grzegorz Peszko, lead economist of the World Bank, who led the team simulating long-term global decarbonization implications for Russia, for Russian economy. Now, this research covered the period up until 2050. And Grzegorz also produced some very exciting results. Grzegorz, over to you.
We don't hear you, Grzegorz. Oh, we don't hear you now. No, no sound. Colleagues, do you hear Grzegorz? Probably it is my problem.
Нет, Игорь, не слышим. Grzegorz, we don't hear you.
No, we cannot hear you, Grzegorz. There is no sound. We can see you, we cannot hear you.
Нет.
I understand that you can hear us, but we cannot hear you.
Try to fix something in the settings. No. Так, видимо, Grzegorz решил переподключиться.
Okay, apparently Grzegorz is trying to reconnect. No sound. No sound from Grzegorz.
Он переподключается, видно.
Давайте, пока Grzegorz переподключается.
Okay, while Grzegorz is struggling with the technology, let us respond to the question and to the comment that we got in the chat.
And just respond to one more comment as Grzegorz is relaunching his Zoom nowadays. Now, please note that GDP growth by 6% accompanied by a 4% decline in real household consumption. That will mean further increase in disparities in terms of income and wealth distribution in Russia. This might be dangerous increase of social tensions, etc. Could you respond to that?
I mean, I wouldn't agree more. I mean, that's why we put the note that transition needs to be managed carefully, right? I mean, we really need social protection. We really need to ensure a just transition, right? I mean, I completely agree with the comment.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now
Yes.
it is perfect. Great. So
Yes, we can hear you.
the floor is yours now, Grzegorz.
Okay, so now you should be able to see my screen as well. Do you?
Yes, we do.
Full success. I rarely use Zoom, so I'm not very good at connecting. So, спасибо большое, Igor. Добро пожаловать всех. Меня зовут Grzegorz.
Igor, thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Grzegorz Peszko. I'm a lead economist at the World Bank Department in DC that deals with environmental management and environmental protection. I also contributed to the report, to this report, and I'm also participating in the CCDR mentioned by Sandeep. With your permission, I will switch into English. For it would be easier for you and would be faster for me.
So thank you very much once again. So my colleagues have told you about the simulations of the possible impact of a very specific design of the climate action in the major trading partner of Russia, European Union, and also the impact of a very specific instrument that the European Union has proposed already to accompany the climate action in EU, which is this carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, I'd like to talk to you about what if. Right, so I'd like to talk to you about the implications of possible future scenarios where a much bigger coalition of climate policy leaders, as we call them, primary movers of climate action, mainly importers of fossil fuels or net importers of fossil fuels, also undertake a very ambitious climate action. And in some cases, they impose border carbon adjustment taxes that in our simulations are much more stringent than EU. And what if they don't? So do we have the emission limit, the emission leakage? Do we have how the global economy reacts, and especially how the economies of the countries who are depending on fossil fuels, such as Russia, how such countries react to such shocks, and how they can respond to such shocks. And we are not doing it just for fun, but we are doing it in the spirit of what Professor Prostakov was talking of, trying to bring the different countries together in this new wave of globalization that he mentioned, bringing different countries together. Basically countries that are importing fossil fuels and have much stronger natural incentives to decarbonize, and countries who are extracting them, who are using them at home, who are exporting them, who are usually much more reluctant to decarbonize. Because Paris Agreement doesn't have any top-down, emission limits, any top-down commitments. It's a bottom-up agreement where countries determine their commitments nationally, but then in order to start cooperating together in this global climate action, they must see their self-interest in cooperative action. So in this spirit, we are talking about this, the incentives to undertake cooperative action by Russia, as well as by the countries who are exporting fossil fuels like Russia. So first of all, let us see if Russia is very vulnerable to the global transition away from fossil fuels, and all these global mega trends of low carbon transition. But then vulnerable means vulnerable compared to who? So this slide shows the index of preparedness of different countries to the global energy transition or low carbon transition. And this index has two dimensions. In the vertical dimension, you see the exposure to the impacts or to the risks of low carbon transition. And in the horizontal dimension, you see the index of resilience to this impact or to any major external shock. The exposure index means that the higher the country is on this graph, the more exposed it is. And we have 4 indicators of exposure. Some of them are related to exposure to fossil fuel revenues. Others are related to exposure through the carbon intensity of manufacturing exports, for instance, or power generation, carbon intensity of power generation. On the horizontal level, resilience has 11 indicators, and some of them are related to the position of a country on the global supply curve. So that means, if the extraction costs for oil, gas, or mining costs for coal are high, that means that the country find it more difficult to manage the impact of low carbon transition, because it can be priced out of the market more quickly and not be able to receive revenues for a longer time. Then there are several other indicators of resilience which are related to the economic complexity, to the depth of the financial system, to the macro fiscal stability. So all this traditional indicators of how resilient a country is to external policy shocks. So by all these measures, you can see that Russia, I hope you can see in this graph that Russia is, belong to the countries who are exposed and not resilient relatively to the countries who are importing fossil fuels. So definitely Russia is less prepared to manage low carbon transition impact than the countries who are net fossil fuel importers. But compared to all these red dot countries, who are the major fossil fuel producers, especially hydrocarbon producers, and also major exporters, Russia is relatively well prepared. It's not so exposed as many of them and more resilient than many of them. So that means that Russia has a capacity, which Igor also showed. We here show a little bit more indicators, but basically confirming his point that Russia has a space to deal with low carbon transition. But the question is what can be this impact of low carbon transition and how to use this space to to navigate the low carbon transition successfully. So this is the scenario structure that we have run with the same envisaged model, but slightly modified compared to the model that colleagues have shown. So we are looking at the global scenario. So we have divided countries into several different groups. On the highest level, we divided them into two stylized hypothetical climate clubs. So one climate club is assumed to be consisting of the net oil and gas and coal importers who are assumed to behave as primary movers of climate action. The countries who are first to introduce high carbon prices that represent the stringency of climate policies. The second climate club consists of the countries that are dependent on fossil fuels, and you will see how we divide them further to the different groups of fossil fuel dependent countries. What is important is that we run the scenarios not to predict the future or not to tell what the best future is. These are simulation scenarios. What if exploration of the different possible future or plausible future to help the countries like Russia navigate the deep uncertainty about the low carbon transition. And this is very important because we're not trying to preach or predict what the future will look like, because we don't have a legislative proposal like EU CBAM from China, from US, from Japan, from India, from Korea. So what we do is we say instead that nobody knows when and whether China or India or Japan will introduce their very stringent carbon prices and climate policies. But the decision-making of responsible governments under deep uncertainty is to learn about the best case scenarios and the worst case scenarios and the many scenarios in between in order to be prepared as the new future unfolds and as we learn more information, to be prepared for the worst case scenarios and strategically navigate towards the best case scenarios, or at least the best case scenarios given circumstances that unfold. And that's the spirit of the scenarios. And this is the spirit of our dialogue with the Russian government. I'm now in Moscow. I've spent a week meeting Ministry of Finance, central bank colleagues, Ministry of Economic Development, a lot of different stakeholders having very honest discussion about, how little we know about the future, but we have to act now, to be ready for the future. So we use the envisage model with major extension to it because we have included the endogenous oil, gas, and coal extraction model, where we have reserves and the supply cost from these reserves of oil, gas, and coal for all countries in the world, often divided by different fields. And we have cost functions for them. So when the model endogenously produce prices for oil, gas, and coal, the different fields in different countries either stop producing if the prices go down, or increase production and start producing when the prices go up, depending on what are your extraction costs, where a different country is on the supply curve. So as I said, the scenarios, exploratory. First of all, is the scenario where basically all countries just introduce their minimum commitments related in their national determined contributions submitted to the Secretariat of the Climate Convention. So there is no new policies in addition to those that were committed to, and certainly no carbon border adjustment taxes. Then we have a cooperative scenario, which again is a stylized hypothetical scenario where all countries in the world somehow miraculously decide to act together and introduce the same level of carbon pricing all around the world. And we run the carbon prices we simulate what carbon prices would be needed to achieve the 2-degree goals of Paris Agreement. We have some simulations, some sensitivity analysis of higher carbon prices to achieve even 1.5 degree. But here I want to focus on this 2-degree scenarios. And in the cooperative scenarios, these prices you see on the left side, these green lines, reach a little bit more than $120 in 2050. But we don't know if Russia or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, other fossil fuel exporters, will want to cooperate in future. So that's why we run the scenarios where the same temperature goal of 2 degrees is achieved by the unilateral action of only fossil fuel importers, so only climate policy leaders or primary movers alone, without participation of all fossil fuel exporters. So in the language of the international, economics of international cooperation, of international agreements, we call them free riders. So what if these fossil fuel exporters free ride on the effort of the fossil fuel importers? So if importers act alone, their carbon prices have to be much higher in order to achieve the same temperature targets. So in the unilateral scenario without border adjustment taxes, this carbon prices applied only by the fuel importers reach almost $400 a ton. But in subset of these unilateral scenarios, we say, okay, but then probably the industry in these countries will be very upset that they have to face such a high carbon price and their competitors from Russia and other countries do not. So they will say, they will demand that their governments introduce this border carbon adjustments on the board on their imports. And in our simulations, we assume that this border carbon adjustments will cover the whole value chain emissions. So it means not only scope 1 and 2, as my colleagues have discussed in the EU CBAM scenarios, but also scope 3 emissions. Somebody needs to mute, I think. All right, so now the results. First of all, let us see at the kind of global picture, which groups of countries have what incentives to cooperate or not. So on the right-hand side, you have this colored shaded part, which shows that on the most right-hand side, overall, globally, cooperation is the optimum scenario. It's nothing new. All the standard optimization models always show that it's better to cooperate, it's cheaper to cooperate to achieve the same goal than not. But the next two bars show two groups of these primary movers or climate policy leaders. The first mover is actually losing a lot on the climate policy scenarios. These are climate policy leaders from the middle-income countries who are net importers of fossil fuels, but it includes China and India. That means it includes very carbon-intensive industries and power sectors. So these countries, they lose almost 2% of GDP in the scenarios where they have to act alone to achieve global temperature targets. The next group of countries, climate policy leaders from the high-income countries, CPL high, are basically all OECD countries, including Europe, US, Canada, and Japan, and Korea, and others. These countries clearly have the strongest incentives to lead on climate action. What connects them, these two groups of countries, is that they both benefit from cooperative climate action. Look, the losses of GDP are higher in the non-cooperative scenarios when they act alone, when the rest of the world, the fossil fuel exporters, cooperate. If you move to the left side of the graph, all the unshaded countries show that the yellow bars, which represent the unilateral climate action of the fossil fuel importers, are the best scenarios for them. That means that they lose the least if they do not cooperate by introducing domestic carbon prices and rely on OECD countries, China, India, and others to do the climate job for them. So, but then cooperative scenarios represented by the green bars are good idea and tempting for some of these countries because they represent the highest losses. But if you look at the Middle East and North Africa, including the Gulf countries, Iran, Libya, but primarily driven here by the WE&IA, Saudi Arabia, and others, and ECA, which includes Russia, for these groups of countries, the red scenarios, which represents the unilateral action of the rest of the world, but with this very high border carbon adjustment taxes, represent the worst case scenario. So although it may be tempting from the economic output perspective, may tempting to refrain from cooperation and go ahead without domestic carbon prices while the rest of the world decarbonizes, this scenario is very risky. Because if the counterfactual is that such a big coalition of importers with such a big market power introduces very stringent border carbon adjustments, that can create a lot of disruptions to these countries. So it shows that the incentives to move ahead with global cooperative actions are different across different country groups. But for many countries who have incentives not to cooperate, the threats or the possibility of global border adjustment taxes like that are a strong incentive to engage in the cooperative carbon prices. And that actually could involve several benefits. Well, how does it translate into the incentives for not necessarily the whole countries, but for the producers and exporters of coal, gas, oil, and petroleum? So these results are for Russia only. And the message is kind of similar, but more nuanced. And the nuance is that if you look at the change of exports of oil producers in Russia, actually, they are the best off in the cooperative scenarios. Even the export of oil in cooperative scenarios increases originally. And then it decreases as the rest of the world decarbonizes, but not as fast as in the scenarios where the rest of the world undertakes this very high carbon pricing. And the reason is, just like as Hassan said before, we were kind of wondering why do we receive such results? But then there is a strong economic intuition behind it. And the economic intuition is that when the rest of the world, consisting of the largest buyers of oil from Russia goes ahead with very high cost of oil domestically, their transport sector gets rid of the internal combustion engines very quickly, or quicker than in the cooperative scenarios where the oil prices for consumers in the oil importing countries are lower. So that would show that that oil producers and petroleum producers actually should be interested in Russia's cooperative behavior in terms of domestic carbon prices, if the counterfactual is that the rest of the world goes ahead with the very stringent carbon prices at home. It's different for coal and gas exporters. For them, cooperative carbon prices in Russia do not have the same effect, because they chop off the export demand, but they also suffocate or reduce the domestic demand for coal and gas. So in a way, on both fronts, the exports are suffering, as well as domestic rents are suffering. But the bottom line is that here, that coal and gas exporters and producers may have slightly different incentives for Russia to cooperate in the global climate action than oil producers. And it's also shown very nicely when we look at the value of stranded assets of coal, oil and gas reserves in Russia under the different scenarios. Because oil and gas rents are calculated as the difference between the expected revenues and the expected costs of production, not only from exports, but also from domestic consumption. So you can see that that the oil rents are highest in the cooperative scenarios, and for both oil and gas, the best scenario for the future value of oil rents is the non-cooperative scenarios, even with border carbon adjustments. So that shows that political economy of global cooperation in many fossil fuel dependent countries who export not just oil but also gas and coal can be a complex issue to manage. The next is that, how about the society? This graph shows the changes in welfare relative to the baseline scenario. And here the message is very clear that, again, the non-cooperation by Russia, as the rest of the world is introducing climate policies to reach 2-degree target, the orange bars, can be an attractive proposition for the Russian population, for their welfare, for their disposable income and the consumption. But here the welfare losses of global border carbon adjustment taxes are very high. So immediately cooperative climate action becomes a very attractive proposition. And now part of this attraction is that cooperative carbon prices generate domestic revenues. Domestic revenues, which in the case of the unilateral climate action of Russia's importers of oil, gas, and coal, in these scenarios, it is the importers who are collecting two types of revenues that otherwise can be collected by Russia. One is a portion of resource rents, because the rest of the world reduces demand, hence the both volume and hence the revenues are going down for Russia. So Russia is losing part of the rents from its sales abroad, and a great part of this rent is collected as carbon prices by the fossil fuel importers. On the top of that, the foreign border adjustment taxes certainly collect revenues from importers who are forcing Russian exporters to reduce their export prices. And when Russia acts at home, these revenues are collected by the Russian government and are recycled within economy. So Hassan showed you two kind of stylized ways of recycling this additional carbon tax revenues to either consumption or to investments. We have gone a little bit farther, and we have run the scenarios in which this additional carbon price revenue from Russia's cooperative action are recycled to innovation. We assume that around 1% of GDP, equivalent of the government revenue, which, by the way, is a little bit less than Russian consumers' energy subsidies, which, according to the recent World Bank estimates, account for about 1.4% of the GDP. So if we just recycle 1% of the GDP into innovation activities, and we recycle it to like notional research and development sector or education sector, which over time increases labor productivity to the levels that are comparable to the most productive countries in the world. And we have empirical estimates of this function between the additional expenditure on innovation and the further improvement of labor productivity. So in this case, with this innovation-driven growth, which we call diversification of assets, actually boosts the welfare of Russian citizens above business as usual. So no longer losses, but the productivity-driven growth, innovation-driven growth, more than compensates all the deadweight losses of the carbon pricing. On the other side, we have also simulated what if the same 1% of GDP is used as energy subsidies to major consumers of fossil fuels. So it's even less than what Russia is using now to subsidize energy consumption, fossil fuel consumptions. And we see that the continuation of this growth driven by cheap energy and high energy intensive sectors over time increase the losses to human welfare. So Russian citizens would be better off if the country cooperates and recycles its resources to the productivity-driven sectors of the economy. So this is the end of my story. What comes out of this story is that in Russia there may be an incentive, just like for all other fossil fuel producers. The low carbon transition can have a very powerful macro pressure on the fossil fuel producers, which is encouraging the diversification, which is very emission intensive, very carbon intensive. And such diversification is a good hedge for the fossil fuel and commodity price volatility, but it increases exposure to low carbon transition. And these macroeconomic pressures can be are very logical, and it is about when the rest of the world increasing carbon taxes, they reduce the exports and the export revenues. That reverses what economics we call a Dutch disease. So through the exchange rate, so the pressure on ruble is falling. The ruble devaluates. That means that the manufacturing, export-oriented manufacturing sectors in Russia are increasing their output and exports. And that means that most of these manufacturing sectors are in the fossil fuel value chain, are users of fossil fuels. And also because the export prices are lower, also the opportunity cost for these high energy and fuel intensive sectors, the opportunity cost of using fuel are also
Я считаю, что вы не писали работу, соответственно.
So that's the one conclusion, that really fossil fuel dependent countries have to make an extra effort to diversify not just beyond fossil fuels and extractive industries, but also beyond fossil fuel intensive industries and value chains. And carbon pricing is an essential element of removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Second is that policies make a big difference. And I said carbon pricing, fiscal policy instruments, energy pricing is the key to this innovation-driven diversification and growth that discovers new sources of comparative advantage outside of the current kind of comfort zone of the economic agents. And the third is that participation in global efforts to reach the Paris Agreement is an important strategic choice for Russia. And as we have seen, it may not be the first choice of Russia, but if the counterfactual is that other countries are serious about domestic climate actions, it may be in the best Russia's interest to introduce cooperative climate policies, but then we discuss in this report and in the following climate change development report, we will go much deeper about how this cooperative climate action may look like for Russia, and especially in the context of reintegrated Russia into the global trade value chains, especially in this green product space. Thank you so much.
Спасибо, Grzegorz. Уважаемые коллеги, мы имеем сейчас некоторое время для...
Grzegorz, thank you very much. We have some time for a Q&A.
Grzegorz, we have already one question in chat. Could you explain how you introduce the labor productivity in your model?
So this was estimated by our colleagues, but Professor van der Meers-Bruch from the Purdue University was our chief modeler in this exercise. So through the literature review, we have looked at the different countries' innovation records and R&D expenditures, and also investments and expenditures on education. And there is a literature of the empirical evidence that investments in R&D and investment in education is linked to the productivity improvement with a certain lag. There is a research paper that my team put together, and it's part of the broader model documentation available on the website. But we can, if someone is interested, please get in touch with us. We can share the specific empirical research with you if you're interested in the technical details.
Спасибо. Так, коллеги.
Thank you. Colleagues, any further questions to Grzegorz? Feel free to ask. We have some time for Q&A.
We have one more question in chat. Please read it. Could you please compare Russia's real GDP in your model and in the model used by Hassan and Daniel in 2030?
I mean, as Igor, as you mentioned.
Игорь, ну, как вы сказали, действительно, мы немножко иную версию модели использовали. Это, в принципе, та же самая модель, но разница вот в чем. Мы ввели модуль, эндогенный модуль добычи полезных ископаемых и еще небольшой модуль по социальному обеспечению. Но разница, в общем-то, невелика. Реальный ВВП в разных сценариях выглядит по-разному, потому что мы использовали разные шоки в наших сценариях. Но вот в нашем сценарии мы допустили гораздо более мощную коалицию стран, которые будут осуществлять амбициозную политику в сфере климата и будут вводить у себя компенсирующие крупные механизмы. Это коалиция, у которой гораздо более существенная рыночная власть. Это не только ЕС, а это и ЕС, и США, Канада, Китай, Индия. И вот в рамках такой огромной коалиции стран, которым подлежит такая значительная рыночная власть, Последствия для ВВП, а также для благосостояния и для всех макроэкономических переменных будет очень велика. Эти последствия будут очень велики. Результаты имеют гораздо больше масштаба. Это не просто 0,3% ВВП. Нет, мы в нашей модели получили значение, соответствующее 2, а то и 3% ВВП с точки зрения потери, а в некоторых сценариях даже потери оказались еще выше. Но опять-таки, вы сами экономисты, вы должны прекрасно понимать, что модели, рассчитываемые модели общего равновесия сглаживают шоки и несколько снижают масштабы потенциальных дисбалансов, потому что после шока наступает равновесие. Поэтому если модель показывает вам 1-2% потери ВВП, то в реальности картина может быть совершенно иной. Возможны существенные шоки, существенные потрясения для отдельных отраслей, о чем говорил Хасан, а другие сектора могут вообще не пострадать.
Models which will compound and aggravate these small shocks. So by all means, the impact is very significant, not only of the border carbon adjustments, but primarily by the impact of just climate policies implemented by different countries.
And Igor, if I can add, I mean, we have a detailed discussion of comparison of two models, assumptions, results, etc. in the report, right? So, I mean, there we explain in detail what I mean, Grzegorz put in few sentences.
Yes, there is a huge annex in the report which compares two models and which discusses the potential discrepancies and the sources of discrepancies and the general scale of these discrepancies. They are not too much. They are quite do not change the general conclusions at all. Anyway. Хорошо, коллеги, есть ли у вас еще вопросы? Или если
Okay,
нет...
any further questions? If not, let's move on. And we'll have some time for a discussion in the end. And as I said, we can revisit all the presentations delivered by Grzegorz, Hassan, and Daniel. Now, I will be the next one to speak. And let me share with you some information in the last two sections of our report. And these two sections deal with the opportunities that Russia might have thanks to this green transformation of the global economy. Let me pick up from Grzegorz' presentation. That's the most important part of our study. Therefore, we have a special section on this. We talk about diversification, how various diversification measures could mitigate possible shocks mentioned by colleagues. Then I will tell you about our recommendations as to how to proceed with climate policies and carbon pricing, how to arrange green finance in this country. And in the end, I will somewhat touch upon new sectors that might benefit from this green transformation or green transition. Now, the bulk of this section requires further specification and deeper analysis. And obviously, this is something that will be addressed in the course of developing the CCDR mentioned by Grzegorz. Now, the CCDR will specify and clarify all the recommendations I will be talking about now. Having said that, I should stress that diversification is key in terms of Russia's responses to the challenges it is facing and in terms of economic growth opportunities in a world which is gradually decarbonizing and where the demand for fossil fuel is declining. Grzegorz mentioned two diversifications, something that he used for his calculations, so-called traditional diversification That's when we diversify away from sectors that are linked to fossil fuels, extraction or refining, when we diversify away from energy-intensive sectors like oil, gas, ferrous metals, cement, fertilizers, chemicals, and so on. Now, we still use our competitive advantages that are due to abundant and inexpensive energy coming from fossil fuels. Now, the other diversification is so-called asset diversification. That's when we diversify to other competitive advantages. That's when we diversify towards sectors that are not energy or carbon intensive. Instead, they use other types of capital that Russia possesses. I'm referring to renewable natural capital, anything that has to do with ecosystem services, agriculture, renewables, tourism, and so on. Hard capital, such as factories, infrastructure, and institutional capital. Now, we diversify towards sectors that employ different production factors, different from fossil fuels. Now, this asset diversification can be achieved by investing in assets, and what Grzegorz was referring to was investing in R&D, innovations, human capital that is used across all the sectors. Now, the other option would be to support specific sectors that may be more in line with the decarbonization scenarios, unlike fossil fuel-based sectors. Now, both sets of scenarios we looked at consider diversification. Now, the cross-cutting idea in the report is that climate policy is a tool that enables diversification, and climate policy may help diversify economy. On the other hand, it is something that will happen anyway. So the Russian economy will diversify no matter what. But it can be well managed. It can be orderly, but it also can be reactive. Responding to the change in the demand on energy sources and on energy-intensive products. Now, what about consequences of CBAM scenarios for Russia? This graph suggests that CBAM scenarios also support some diversification. In other words, we see traditional energy-intensive sectors shrinking, and we see other sectors expanding, such sectors as machinery and equipment, for instance. Now, this is a picture that was used by Grzegorz. He used some different colors. Now, this is a chart that gives you different diversification scenarios in case global carbon pricing is introduced. And as Grzegorz mentioned, traditional diversification, in fact, aggravates the situation. Say, if we allocate some of our fossil fuel rents to subsidize energy-intensive industrial production activities, we lose. We lose even compared to the baseline scenario. This kind of diversification will not save us from the global green transformation implications. Now, if we diversify assets, if we allocate 1% of our rent into sectors that employ different types of capital, in this case, such sectors would be R&D and innovations, well, Russian economy stands to win from this. And Russian economy performs much better compared to the baseline. In fact, the benefits might be quite significant. The benefits thanks to this global green transformation. However, the benefits start to appear after 2030 because I'm sorry, 2030, because there is a significant lag between investing into human capital and returns. So in short term, we will not get such impacts. But anyway, international cooperation scenarios, Russia cooperating on carbon emissions reduction and the absence of free-riding behavior and asset diversification and allocating some rents from carbon-intensive and fossil fuel sectors into human capital and innovations sectors would be the best possible scenario out of all possible scenarios. This might help Russia easily weather the global transformations. Now, diversification indeed is key, but climate policy would be needed to support this diversification. Well, fortunately, this idea seems to be onboarded by the Ministry of Economic Development and the Russian government. And to a large extent, I think this is a factor behind the more proactive stance of the Russian government on climate policy. We heard about the various documents, various strategies and declarations, either approved or announced in Russia in the last 2 years. So Russia seems to be very close to developing basic regulatory and legislative framework. All the key documents have been passed by now. However, as our report suggests, this is definitely not enough in order to actually launch and implement active, aggressive, and effective climate policy in this country. In addition to the existing documents, we have to further specify and detail our climate policy. The existing documents are very much fragmented. They need to be integrated. Some of them contradict each other. For instance, there is this goal to maintain emissions at the level of 30% lower than that of 1990, and the target to become carbon neutral by 2060. On the other hand, we have to specify the many goals and objectives set forth by the existing documents. These have to be augmented by roadmaps, implementation plans, cost estimates. We have to identify responsible federal agencies and ministries and so on. So this part of work needs to be completed, and we seem to be in full agreement with the federal agencies responsible for the climate policy in this country and climate agenda in Russia, and they seem to be set on continuing their efforts. We have to integrate climate policy into our economic policy. Unfortunately, we still see a major contradiction between this low carbon development strategy and energy strategy of Russia. Overall, low carbon agenda doesn't seem to be a part of the socioeconomic development agenda. Russia does not have a vision of it being part of a low carbon world. We don't know what kind of competitive advantages Russia would have. All these will have to be conceptualized and will have to be set forth in policy documents. There are many other important things, such as carbon pricing, something that colleagues have mentioned a lot. Now, the existing law, the law on regulating GHG emissions, is already a major step forward compared to a situation where we did not have this law in place. But again, the regulation is not very stringent. And It speaks about registration of low carbon projects, but it does not provide major incentives for companies to reduce their GHG emissions. We believe that carbon must be priced in this country. There are three reasons. First, this would help dramatically reduce the risks for Russian exports. Second, this would be a powerful tool to support diversification of our economy, which in turn will also indirectly bring down risks. And third, this will help bring in investment into the Russian economy from the global markets. But obviously, carbon price should be introduced very cautiously. Let me get back to the chart shown by Hassan in his presentation. Now, this chart suggests that there are huge differentials in effects depending on how we spend the revenues from carbon pricing. If, say, we were to introduce a carbon tax, or we introduce something like an ETS, the revenues could be used either for investment purposes or could be allocated to households. Well, obviously, in reality, we will have something in between. But, well, those are two extremes, and they're shown here on my slide. And the differences are tremendous. Now, if all the revenues were to be invested, this would not affect our GDP dramatically. Instead, this would hurt household incomes, and this is something that seems to be inadmissible. On the other hand, if all the revenues were to be allocated to households, and if we recycle those revenues for households, there would be no effect on economic growth, but at the same time, the household incomes would not suffer. So we have to come up with a balanced approach. We have to bring together the two recycling options for those revenues. On the other hand, carbon prices, as I said, should be very cautiously inserted into the existing system, the system of industrial policy, social policy, and so on. Carbon price seems to be an add-on to the existing taxes, but this not necessarily should be the case. The carbon price could be introduced indirectly. Carbon price could be embedded in energy taxes for different fossil fuels. We can think of some exemptions where specific sectors or regions or for population groups that are affected disproportionately. So all those design features need to be studied in more detail. In fact, they merit a separate study, a separate research. And apparently this is something that would be done under the CCDR that the World Bank is about to develop. But yeah, once again, we recognize that carbon pricing should be introduced in Russia very cautiously, and it should not become an addition to the existing regulations or taxes. And they should be also accompanied by social policy measures and income reallocation measures. But one way or the other, carbon pricing must be introduced. The question is how and what shape it should take. This is something that seems to be obvious. Now, why carbon pricing may help attract investments to the Russian economy. Look at this slide, please. The costs of abatement in Russia are lower compared to other countries. Here we show marginal abatement costs for different regions as of 2030. That is the share of emissions reductions in case carbon pricing is introduced. So Russia trails only China and India. Now, if we had a global carbon price, which does not exist at the moment and is unlikely to appear anytime soon, the bulk of emission reduction projects would be implemented in Russia. If Russia were to introduce a regulation system that is aligned with international practices, international systems, then Russia would be in a position to attract investment into emission reduction projects. Once again, because the costs in Russia would be lower. And mind you, lower costs does not mean that it would be easier to reduce those emissions. In addition to cost, there are many other factors that prevent us from attaining our goals. I'm referring to administrative barriers, to some other bottlenecks. But anyway, if, say, Russia develops an infrastructure to support a low carbon projects implementation, this would serve as a major argument favoring Russia as a location for such projects. But again, a fairly low carbon price, if introduced in Russia, might result in significant emission reductions. And this is another argument for the introduction of carbon pricing in this country. Now, for the regulation system being developed in this country, including under the Sakhalin pilot and including green finance schemes that have been designed by the WEB. Now, it's important to align all those efforts and measures with global initiatives and standards. We have to work in sync with other countries who might pose as donors. There is such an opportunity, and we should not expect that investment will just flow into Russia. No, of course not. But if we lay down the necessary foundation to help implement the provisions of Article 6, if we agree with the EU and the regulation and on many other aspects, well, there would be no reasons from the economic standpoint not to expect that Russia would not be in a position to attract investment to support such carbon projects. One last point. Which sectors would be the winners? Well, obviously, it's renewable energy sector. I guess this sector would be the key beneficiary from this global green transition. Russia possesses tremendous capacity in this respect, including in remote areas. Now, the renewable energy projects, the wholesale markets already receive significant support. And we have a lot of room for improvement with respect to projects to be implemented in remote areas. And yet, this is where renewable energy might produce tremendous benefits. Hydrogen, another sector that will win carbon capture and storage, some other traditional technologies such as atomic power and hydro, they also can benefit from global green transformation. Another important sector is a so-called climate smart mining. And that is a sector, as the name suggests, is a mining sector that would be using low carbon energy. This is a sector that would be using electricity. The sectors would also require metals like lithium, nickel, rare earth metals, and so on. And yeah, this is what Russia has, and Russia is abundant in such resources. And Russia may be one of the countries to support global transformation with such inputs for the benefit of the Russian economy. And clearly, Russia is well positioned to do this. The report indicates Russia's position with respect to each mineral, each metal, And in fact, for each of the mineral or each metal, Russia would be in top 5. Russia can dramatically expand the production of all those metals and minerals. And finally, forests. Decarbonization in this country is unthinkable without major efforts to increase absorption capacity of forests and increase their sequestration potential. Now, the report speaks about climate smart forestry a lot. Look, if we do nothing, forests alone will not help Russia to achieve its carbon neutrality, and they're unlikely to help us in our climate agenda. In order for Russian forests to become a major factor in the global transformation, both worldwide and in Russia, we have to introduce a number of smart forestry measures. We have to enhance sustainability of forests. We have to protect our forests against wildfires. We have to develop circular economy components in the forestry sector and so on. I will not go into detail. Feel free to read all this in our report that speaks at length about all those issues, and the CCDR will cover this in even more detail. Now, this in fact exhausts my presentation, and now we can move on to Q&A. Feel free to ask me, feel free to pose your questions to any speaker. Feel free to share your ideas, your comments based on our presentations, and I hope that we will benefit a lot from your comments, and I hope you will develop even more interesting comments once you've read the report. Thank you.
And I'll be happy if there are any questions or comments. If you'd like to take the floor, please raise your hand. There is an option in Zoom, or you may somehow indicate it to me, or you may write your comment in the chat box. I don't see any questions so far, and no comments so far.
Ну что, нет, у нас иссякли уже очень много. Вот. Если ЕС сократит на 40%...
If the EU reduces by 40% the import of Russian gas, what are they going to hit themselves during winter time? That's a good question. Who's going to take the question? Daniel Hassan?
On the EU issues.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Igor? I mean, the translation was too fast. I couldn't catch it.
Sorry. If the EU would reduce the import of Russian gas by 40%, what would be the sources of heating of them in winters in the future?
Well, Daniel might answer better because this is a question about the EU strategy on climate. But in the model, I mean, they will switch to electricity, right? I mean, especially supplied by renewables.
Yeah, that's Daniel. Yeah, I think that's broadly the case in terms of their net zero strategy. They'll look ultimately to electrify heating for households.
If I may, to this answer, in fact, the model, what does the model give? The model describes the economic forces which currently emerge in different markets, including global markets, and how they are reflected in economic solutions. It gives an opportunity to look at the dynamics of the whole situation what can happen right now, what can happen in 10 years perspective. This is the benefit of the model. This is the drawback of the model. We cannot say what will happen tomorrow, but we may say that it is likely and it is important to look at different factors of global development, both for the mid, short-term perspective till 2030, and particularly in long-term perspective. And this particular point, the most important finding in this report and in many others by the World Bank and other agencies, we cannot but look at that. If we do not consider such events, we'll lose different opportunities, which are very important for Russia to create new opportunities and advantages on the global market. The same is true for the export of gas. It is very important, but the importance is changing. And the importance of gas as the export goods for Russia or the imported product or commodity for Europe is going to change within the time. There are particular risks of uncertainty, the uncertainty of the process, but we need to take these risks into account, and the model demonstrates how these risks are important. This is what the major benefit of this model is. I'd like to add that we do not work out forecasts. We don't say that is going to be the case. We say, what if? What if this strategy announced by the EU, carbon neutrality by 2050, what if it is implemented? What if all these states implement what they have committed to? We don't say that they're going to commit it to the fullest extent. Maybe not, it's possible. If no, the Russian gas will still be supplied to Europe, but nevertheless, these strategies have been announced. At least we need to calculate the consequences. What if they are not implemented? Probably the implication is going to be a little bit softer rather than demonstrated by the colleagues, by Grzegorz particularly. As for CBAM, our evaluation is softer rather than major evaluations we saw in Russia before. Grzegorz.
Because I think we are kind of a little bit walking around this question, but the question has a very important, meaning, which is that low carbon transition and phasing out of fossil fuels, even for importers, will not be easy, especially everywhere, but for different reasons. But for Europe, it's not an easy choice. It's a choice that Europe has done for two reasons. One is, is the concern about the impacts of climate change. But another one is that, as an importer of gas, Europe certainly has incentives to reduce this import dependency. So, climate policies are useful in this respect because they do increase the reliance of the energy sources over which Europe has more control of. So, climate, this global effort towards cooperative climate action is not a beauty contest only. It's also a strategic, multi-stage strategic game for the market shares of, on the one hand, declining industries, because there will be winners and losers among gas and oil exporters, as some of them are exiting the market, which we have seen recently. A few big exporters exited the market in response to the demand shock of COVID. And then, the demand rebounded, and, the remaining producers benefit from it because their prices are high. So there will be a lot of this kind of market fluctuations, and even our CG simulations show it, that the price volatility of gas and oil are increasing. the level of prices is also increased, but volatility is increasing. This is not a good news for countries who are dependent on the exports of this fossil fuel commodities. So I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of insight from this modeling that are very, pragmatic. The fossil fuel importers have incentives, stronger incentives to go ahead and reduce imports of fossil fuels from producers. And also there is this price volatility issue that is not a good news for exporters.
Спасибо, Grzegorz.
Thank you, Grzegorz.
We have one comment in chat that one can assume that this study has focused on the economy where export is the main driver. In future modeling, it might be interesting to consider domestic consumption as the case where domestic demand is the main driver of the Russian economy. Do you have comments on that? I don't think that we consider exports as a main driver.
No, I mean, if I may, I mean, probably in any CG model, actually, domestic production is the main driver, right? I mean, because these are neoclassical models. But because of the way we presented the results, I mean, because CBAM is a trade instrument, so we focused on exports and we focused on EU exports because EU is the party that uses this instrument. I mean, it can look like, I mean, exports are the driver, but actually exports change. This has implications for production and also domestic demand. Then, I mean, all the substitution or impact on the sectors are because of these domestic forces, right? And in the report, we shed more light on these links. But as I said, I mean, during the presentation, we just wanted to show really the focus of the report. So that's why we might have given the wrong impression. And I guess same for the longer term modeling work.
One more question in my personal chat. It is about technologies that probably are not commercialized now, but such technologies as managed plasma or some other technologies which may be used in theory but are not used nowadays in practice. So they, of course, were not simulated within our model just because we do not cost curves for them. And probably colleagues will tell a little bit more in detail about which types of technologies are considered in the model. I mean, green technologies of green transition, and on which base the choice of these technologies was made.
I mean, on the CBAM scenarios, we really didn't differentiate, right? I mean, the sector is green to the extent that their emissions are lower than others. But this issue of, I mean, the non-commercialized technologies like hydrogen, I mean, CCS, etc. I mean, at the bank, we see it coming, right? I mean, and we are working on improving our models to be able to accommodate them. And I know Grzegorz was, I mean, considering some options for the CCDR. Maybe Grzegorz, if you can, I mean, tell us the frontier on this.
Yes, I mean, our approach to modeling of both teams was conservative at this stage. So we deliberately didn't want to make, heroic assumptions about, for instance, bioenergy with CCS. Many models do it in the IPCC modeling scenarios. They take these magic technologies and they assume certain costs at which endless mitigation is possible. We didn't do it. We didn't have enough information on hydrogen, let alone plasma or whatever. So we don't have them in the model. That's why, in a way, our mitigation costs are and opportunities are limited with respect to maybe possible 10 or 15 years from now. Now, a year after, a little bit less than a year after we've done all these scenarios, we indeed have a little bit more information about hydrogen at least. So we are now working with a team of Russian energy modelers and a big team of international experts on hydrogen to develop realistic cost curves for substitution of different hydrogen technologies, production technologies first, using gas, using hydrolysis, even using pyrolysis, so both green and blue hydrogen, and also substitution of hydrogen for different fossil fuels used in industry, in transport in particular, and going forward also perhaps in electricity production. So hydrogen will be in the new model that we will run for Russia very soon. But a lot of other exotic technologies, we tend to be more realistic on making such assumptions.
Yeah,
conservative.
Yeah, and as in most of CGE models, so here no any breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs are taken into account that are in principle possible, but nobody knows when exactly they are possible and in which areas and so on. So if some technological breakthroughs may happen, so it may make the green transformation a bit faster. Yeah, but of course it can't be models at this level. So it's just the gradual decrease in costs of different technologies is suggested, but not any breakthroughs, right?
That's true. That's true. But the scenarios that you also discussed in your presentation, Igor, our scenarios on asset diversification, where we assume that a portion of GDP is used for this notional research and development sector, is kind of approximating what Romer has got a Nobel Prize in economics, which is this endogenous technology growth. This is not technology-based assumption, but it is assumption that at some point, Russia could invest in the acceleration of the productivity improvement through technologies. We don't specify what technologies, but we run this empirically based functional relationships between investments in innovation and outcomes of innovation for productivity. So it's not a technology breakthrough explicitly, but it has a similar effect over time.
Okay, thanks. We have one more question in chat. How did the model consider sanctions and counter sanctions against Russia and the EU?
Maybe I'll take it first.
Yeah.
So, first of all, we simulate border carbon adjustment measures. In order to call them sanctions, they would need to be WTO incompatible. The way that EU has designed its border carbon adjustment mechanism is very careful for being compatible with WTO. And I would also say, and it's my personal view, that it's carefully designed not to harm anybody. I mean, if you look at this design, there's so much delays in implementation, so much phasing in. There's so much opportunities given to firms and governments to react. And, we had a discussion with the Minister of Finance a few days ago, and they have several options now under discussion how to react to the EU CBAM. None of these options include retaliation. Because I think there is also growing awareness in Russia that is not worth it, and that EU CBAM design is WTO compatible, and also does not have a real sanctions. And I said it was Morocco who triggered EU CBAM. It was not Russia. The scenarios that we simulated with this broader border adjustment taxes, they can be closer to what we would say, what we could call sanctions, because in principle they can be WTO compatible, but it will have to be proven under Article 20, as exceptions and justified on case-by-case basis. But it's a very good point, and we had a discussion in the team whether whether it is possible that that some countries will retaliate. I don't think we will run these scenarios, but as my colleague said, the models that we use are public domain, and we already are talking to the Ministry of Economic Development that we can give away these models, that we can train your experts in using these models, and you can run whatever scenarios you want. And if you can simulate counter sanctions, sure. It is not, isn't it possible? Yes, it is possible. This is what we saw in 2012 when EU tried to extend the emissions trading system to aviation. Actually, most countries actually retaliated. So, as I said, it's multi-stage strategic game, and different instruments are possible in this game. And the countries will have to are carefully weighting the costs and benefits of using both border carbon adjustments, because one of the costs of the border carbon adjustments is a risk that the other countries, that the trade partners, will retaliate and will have a counter sanctions. I mean, as economists, we have to talk about it with plain language, because it's possibility.
I mean, if I can add, I mean, first to complement Jagor's, I mean, the comment, I mean, at least with a CG model or any macro model, retaliation will never be welfare improving. So it will look irrational to retaliate. I mean, so this is almost given the design of the models. But I understand the question differently. So I want to make one point. I mean, I understand Andrei's question as the existing trade frictions and sanctions, etc. Because I mean, I was one of the authors of a paper on the Russia sanctions against EU for dairy products in 2016-15, and then EU's retaliation. And we were trying to show what and while running the scenarios for this study, I had it in mind, right? I mean, should we take this into account? Because they might have important implications. Okay, I mean, what if these, I mean, the sanctions are existing trade frictions, not only sanctions, right? I mean, all trade frictions are removed or not, because they will have significant impact, right? I mean, on our results. But of course, we didn't do that because we wanted to keep the story concrete. But I mean, that might be a nice extension in future, right? I mean, because Igor and I mean the Renault and Ivan mentioned that this collaboration would go on. I mean, that might be a specific point to look at the trade sanctions or trade frictions and their relationship to CBAM and other climate policies.
Так, коллеги, есть ли у нас еще
Dear
вопросы?
colleagues, do we have any other questions?
Кажется, нет.
It seems to me we don't have any other questions.
Так, может быть, кто-то хочет прокомментировать.
Maybe someone to take the floor and give a comment.
Сделаю.
So I'll be happy to give you the floor.
Так, ну, кажется, нет.
We don't have any
Почти 3 часа
so far.
длится семинар.
It's almost 3 hours since the start of our workshop.
Тогда, если нет больше вопросов,
So if we don't have any questions
комментариев, то
and comments,
я тогда с удовольствием передал
I'd like to give the floor to Ksenia Lvovsky,
которая является
who is the
управляющим по окружающей среде
E&B practice manager in ECI of the World Bank. Ksenia,
вам слово.
the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Igor. I'd like to thank all the participants of this workshop. I'll do my best to speak Russian and see what comes out of it. First of all, I'd like to thank the Higher School of Economics for organizing this workshop, for the great partnership in green economy issues, which we have seen over the recent 2 years, as Igor has mentioned. This report is a joint effort. Igor focused on that, focused on him, contributed a lot. I'd like to thank the team of the World Bank, including Hassan, Daniel, Dragos, and particularly Yelena Struko-Golub and Vlada Nemova, who together with Igor collected all the contributions and inputs and managed to produce such a very interesting report. Today's discussion, during today's discussion, we saw at the point of time 100 people. When the report is going to be published, the English public report will be accessible today. A Russian version will be accessible within several days. Right now, the translation is being made, so maybe it is going to provoke a lot of interest. As Gregos has mentioned, it is important to understand that there is the analysis of scenarios. This is not kind of a forecast. This is not a concrete political tools. This is the analysis of scenarios and different tools, just to give a kind of assistance device to think where we need to move forward, to analyze additional factors, to have specific political tools, for example, the carbon tax, quotas, or limitations, or the combination of all the above mentioned in different compositions, which the report doesn't respond to, but gives a kind of food for thought in this area. And we hope to continue our work. The discussion was very fruitful. It was very fruitful, so we can understand which questions are to be answered in the CCDR, which we are preparing under the Gregos leadership. It seemed to me that in today's discussion, it is very important to understand how it can be stipulated better, how the analysis can be presented, for it not to lead to any misinterpretation. I find this discussion very fruitful and useful for our future work. I do hope that we will continue our work and collaboration with the Higher School of Economics, and the Higher School of Economics will agree to be a part of the Council on the CCDR, and we will be working in other areas as well, since the topic is very complex. And this is just the beginning of our work. This is just the peak of the iceberg. I'd like to give the floor to Yelena as one of the leaders of this particular report work. After that, we'll be able to close the event, but we will be happy to see you in the near future. Thank you very much. Yelena, the floor is yours. Ksenia, thank you very much. That has been a very interesting and comprehensive work. We started 1.5 years ago, and we have managed to bring together very good people with great expertise. I see a lot of them today. I'd like to mention that this work was focused on decarbonization. We talked about prospects of green transition, adaptation issues, and risk issues for Russia haven't been touched upon. This is a big domain of work. We as a World Bank and many Russian organizations are going to look into. And it might be the additional part of this puzzle which Russia will have and will make the right decision on the path to this new green economy in the future. We're very thankful to everyone. We're very thankful to Ksenia, who led this work to our counterparts to Higher School of Economics. We do hope for further collaboration. Thank you, dear colleagues. I'd like to, from my side, and on behalf of Higher School of Economics, that we are very thankful for the opportunity to collaborate together for very deep, constructive work undertaken. We shouldn't assess our results. This is to be done by the colleagues who are going to read this report, but it seems to me that this particular report is at least looking at the scale of issues raised and the ambitious nature of the tasks set may be of a very important role in further discussion in Russia on the conversations about the role of Russia in a new changing world. And this is the importance of the report. So together with my colleagues who participated in contributing to this report, I'm happy to be a part of that. Ivan, the floor is yours. I disconnected for a period of time, but I followed the discussion. It was a very interesting discussion, in fact, but I don't consider myself to be a specialist in this particular area. For me, it was very useful, professionally high quality of the presentations and the report itself. I'm very happy to see our further cooperation, and I'm very happy to see kind of a team, staff from the Higher School of Economics and the World Bank team. And the report is a major outcome, great outcome. But one of the other results of this work is a harmonized cooperation between our specialists. And we see a mutual understanding and willingness to continue our cooperation. I'd like to wish you success in your further projects. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues. So that's the time we closed our workshop. I'd like to thank all the participants, all those who asked questions and commented on the questions. That has been very successful and interesting discussion. I'd like to thank the interpreters. Thank you very much, interpreters, and all the rest.